Hi everybody, Jayme Yahr here, Associate Curator at the Crocker Art Museum. Thrilled to be with you this afternoon for Gallery Bytes. And I want to let you know that there's a few folks with me behind the scenes. Mallory Marsh, our Associate Director of Education, is here, and she will be helping me with any questions and comments and some of the interaction today. We have Brian Sir, one of our designers, and Houghton Kinsman, our Adult Education Coordinator and producers of Gallery Bytes. So lots of people with me behind the scenes. I'm really excited because today we're talking about our new exhibition that is only open about a week. So lots of opportunity to come and see it here at the Crocker. This is Towns, Trains, and Terrain, Early California Prints from the Pope Collection. So the idea behind Gallery Bytes today is give you a little bit of an inside view of how this show came together, why this show is on view, some of the tidbits and key points and key themes of the exhibition, and we'll be showing you a few images from the show. And then I'll be talking about the works behind me, which include a work by Henry Jerome Scheel, which is over here on this side. We'll be talking about the Lightning Express image that is right behind me, which relates to the train that moved from San Francisco Bay to the Sierra foothills. And then on the other side, we'll be talking about the her name was Fannie Palmer image, who worked for Courier and Ives, and thinking about how these train images relate to each other. So I want to encourage you to send in your questions as I'm talking, to provide comments, and I'm going to hopefully answer those live for you here this afternoon from the Crocker. I want to start off by acknowledging that the Crocker Art Museum is on the traditional homeland of the Nisenan people, and that California is the home to many tribes. We respect and acknowledge this land and want to move forward with our Native communities. So with that, I want to jump into talking a little bit about the show. So Towns, Trains, and Terrain, Early California Prints from the Pope Collection. So what does that really mean? The idea behind this exhibition is that it comes from a collection of 200 works of art. Those 200 works all relate in some form to California. This was originally the Pope family collection, and it was generously donated to us just about 2 years ago by Maria Pope and Emily Pope Taylor, and they are the daughters of Peter T. Pope. So really interesting to think about this generous donation to us, but then how does this come together from our permanent collection into an exhibition? And that takes a little bit of time to think through how the works can be kind of culled, but then also narrowed down. So we had 200 works. I had to think about how do you display an exhibition with coherent themes and key points and narratives from that. So when I was looking at the whole 200, I was like, oh my goodness, this is a researcher's dream and a researcher's nightmare. 85 works of the 200 are titled San Francisco. So I was not able to go purely on titles for this show. I needed to think about, how is this the story of San Francisco as a city, which many of us here in Sacramento are very familiar with, being just a little bit east of the Bay here. But how do you make this about the state? How do you make this about the formation of the state? And then how do you make this about the undertold narratives related to the state as well? Many of us in California are familiar with the coastline and the geography. We may be familiar with the mission system and Spanish colonization, but maybe not as familiar with Native American land rights, Chinese immigrant labor, and the railroad, thinking about how many of these key events of the 1800s really impact the way we live today. So that became some of the central themes of the show itself. So from that, I started thinking about, we have land and landscape. We have images of trains, transcontinental railroad trains to the gold fields, and we have a clear connection also with the Crocker Art Museum and trains, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then also thinking about this idea of towns, social scenes, caricatures, San Francisco, and how do all those things go together. So this became this sort of three-pronged approach for the show. So what I want to do is show you a few images to get us rolling, and I'll talk a little bit more about how the show came together in that form. And also this idea that of the 200, I narrowed it down to 100. So you're seeing about half of the collection in the exhibition when you come to the Crocker. In that 100, they're all prints. So I'm not showing you any drawings. I'm not showing you anything that was not an actual print. So this might be, we have one photographic print in the show, but everything else is a lithograph, a mezzotint, an engraving, an etching, some type of printmaking process. So all of that is addressed in the exhibition here as well. So let's go ahead and start off with an image of one of the maps from the show, because I want you to start thinking about kind of how did California exist in terms of geography, and this geography in terms of like physical landscape, but also this kind of mythological or mythical geography. And we have that a lot in this show. One of the earliest works in the show is from 1606. And then the maps move from there through the 1700s. So what you're seeing on the screen now is one of our maps by Nicholas Defer, and it's showing you some of those sort of key geographies, but also key mythologies. So California in these early centuries of map making was often shown as an island. So we see that very oftentimes in these early maps. We also see references to places that did not exist. So Gran Quivira is represented in the map. You can see the little name of it if you look up close. But this was the 7 cities of gold. This was essentially a mythical region that was believed to be somewhere near New Mexico, or present-day New Mexico. This was never found. Spanish explorers often tried to find out where these gold fields were. They were a little far afield. They should have been looking in the Sierra foothills. But that's another one of those mythical geographies that we see here. Oftentimes, Spanish explorers, Dutch explorers, they didn't know if something was an island or a peninsula. Things were a little bit uncertain or unsure, and many of the maps that we have in the show are actually maps that were made by European cartographers who never traveled outside of Europe. So they are reliant on the various expeditions from explorers and the information traveling back to Europe, or they would sort of copycat each other. So one map maker would look at something from the past, make a slight variation, and then move on from there. So maps make up part of that early aspect of the exhibition and help set the stage for the way that we're thinking about California over time. So I'm going to move on to a couple of additional images from the show. So if we move on to our next work, I can talk a little bit about Sacramento. So Sacramento does feature in the exhibition. As you know, that's the location of the Crocker Art Museum where we stand today, and also a really important city in terms of the Transcontinental Railroad, but also in terms of the gold rush. So a lot of this show really focuses on the mid-1800s, thinking about the gold rush from 1848 to about 1853, about a 5-year span in the middle of the 19th century. And when the gold was discovered in Coloma, kind of in the foothills, it set off, as we know, this big migration, many people from the east traveling to the west. But at this time, there was no railroad. This was overland trail. This was steamship, other ways of making this sort of long and treacherous journey to the west. Sacramento became a really important town at this point because it established a location in which goods could be bought, so miners could purchase goods. And one of those individuals that established the first kind of general store for miners was Samuel Brannan. Samuel Brannan is in the exhibition. We have a portrait of him, as well as some of his role with the Vigilance Committee in San Francisco afterward. But he was making thousands of dollars a day off of miners in the gold rush period, so essentially the mid-1800s. It's over $100,000 a day equivalent in 2001. So he was literally raking in the dough at that time. And it's interesting to think about Sacramento in the scene that we just saw, because we see Brannan's store actually located on the right-hand side. We see the Eagle Theater, which was one of the first theaters in the region. And also there is a saloon located right next door to the theater as well. So this is very sort of early gold rush Sacramento in that scene. So Sacramento features heavily in that sort of imagery, and also in the show itself, we do have numerous views that represent Sacramento as sort of a through line or a throughway between San Francisco and the gold fields. If we continue to think about the show a little bit, we'll move to our next image here, which is one of my favorites. It's such a favorite of mine that we literally blew it up to be wall size. And if you come to the exhibition, you can see it as you enter the show. And this is a cartoon called Earthquakey Times. Now, if you're familiar with California history, you probably think about the big 1906 earthquake, which is in all the history books and very well known. But there was a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in 1865, and that was the basis for this cartoon here. Now, 1865, you're probably thinking about context of US history. This is the end of the Civil War. So if you think about that in relation to what's happening in the country as a whole, it gives a little bit of context for the sort of changes happening in the West as well. What I love about this image, if you look on the right-hand side up close, so get your nose up to your screen, you can see a little figure holding a lamppost, and that lamppost is starting to fall inward on the right-hand side. At the top of that lamppost, it actually says 1865, so a little sneaky artistic way to put the date up in there. But that figure holding the lamppost kind of down, he kind of sliding down on that lower right, that's one of the earliest images of Mark Twain that exists in cartoon or caricature form. So Mark Twain, well known for his various writings, Huckleberry Finn and Pudd'nhead Wilson, but also spent time in San Francisco, and he factors into some of the sort of mythology and the way we think about the city and the region during the period. So we have cartoons. One of the best cartoonists, or sort of most well-known cartoonists of the time, is Edward Jump, so he features numerous places throughout the exhibition. We also have scenes from 1906 earthquake. So the Earthquakey Times was 1865, but we have scenes from the 1906 quake. The 1906 quake was an 8.0, roughly 8.0 quake, so really large in terms of the Richter scale. It destroyed 500 blocks within the city of San Francisco. 3,000 people died during that time, mainly not only from the quake itself and falling debris and buildings crumbling, but the resulting fires that happened in the city afterwards. So what you're seeing on your screen now is a representation of the massive fires happening after the quake itself. And tent cities sprung up. There was a curfew that happened afterward to stop looting, and various other sort of measures put in place, as well as additional building codes that came out of that earthquake. But it does, those two quakes do loom large, I think, in California history and are fairly well known, especially for San Francisco. If we keep thinking about the images, the next one that I want to show you is back to thinking about the caricatures or cartoon images in the show. I showed you Earthquakey Times, we looked at Mark Twain, but I just want to talk about this kind of triple grouping in the exhibition. You're seeing on your screen Emperor Norton, and this is a representation at the time of his death. Emperor Norton was a very interesting fellow. He was well known as almost like a mascot of the city of San Francisco, like an orator in many ways. He was an individual who very much championed diversity. He felt that everyone should be treated equally. He felt that cultural heritage, race, gender should all be treated equally in the city. He would roam the streets. He'd often kind of stand on a street corner and kind of espouse his ideas. And he declared himself Emperor Norton and went by that name. Now, he had no military bearing or military role whatsoever, but he did wear a military uniform with like gold epaulets and kind of a hat with a feather, and was well known within the city itself. Now, Emperor Norton is said to have had, and this is a little bit of a San Francisco myth, but is said to have 2 pet dogs. The first one, I'll show you an image here, is, I think we're gonna see the image of Lazarus first, but Lazarus and Bummer. So Lazarus and Bummer and their escapades. 2 dogs, essentially stray dogs in the city. In the city at this time, stray dogs, stray cats, mice and rats, lots of different animals roaming the streets. But there were 2 stray dogs who tended to roam around Montgomery Street, and these are Bummer and Lazarus. Now, Bummer was the first dog to kind of roam around. It is said that Bummer found another stray dog and he had been in a fight, and Bummer kind of helped him reinvigorate himself. So he rose from the dead, so to speak. And this dog is Lazarus. So Bummer and Lazarus and their exploits. They were well documented in the newspapers. They were documented in sort of the newsletters that went around town, lots of word of mouth. They were also well documented in cartoons and caricatures of the time. Now, Edward Jump is credited with the myth that Emperor Norton owned Bummer and Lazarus, but that is not actually true. But what we do see in the image of Lazarus is Emperor Norton presiding over his funeral. So we see on the left-hand side Norton with the epaulets and the hat, and he's kind of standing at this podium and overseeing the funeral of the dog who's lying in the center there with sort of the grave at the bottom of the scene itself. And then we have the Bummer image, in which case Mark Twain actually wrote a little eulogy for Bummer and saying that, you know, he was such a good dog, but kind of ended his time right after his sidekick cohort, Lazarus. So lots of interesting sort of social scenes, how that represents in the city and how that moves along from there. What I want to do now, and again, I'm encouraging those of you who might be watching live, if you have any questions, please put those into the chat. We have lots of folks working with me here who are happy to provide those questions for me, and I want to make sure that they're answered for you in real time, so don't be shy. But with that and kind of the overview of the exhibition, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the works that you see behind me. So I'm going to start off by thinking about the Transcontinental Railroad a little bit and looking at the work on my left, which is the Frances Flora Bond Palmer work that we see here. So these are the works that are right behind me. They represent kind of a train triptych, so to speak. And I want to think a little bit more about what this artwork is showing us, what it means, what we can be thinking about, and how we might want to kind of reconsider what we know or don't know about imagery from the period. So in looking at this work here, you can see a couple things. First off, this is a lithograph. It was created by Frances Flora Bond Palmer. She was one of the only women artists to be employed full-time by Currier and Ives. And you may know Currier and Ives. James Merritt Ives, Nathaniel Currier, they essentially were together in terms of being a printmaking or lithography firm. They were based in New York City, so they were not a West Coast printer. But what they did do is create, over the course of 70 plus years, 7,000 lithographs for sale, like over 7,000 works. Now, they titled themselves the Grand Central Depot for cheap and easy prints to purchase, essentially. That's a summary, but they literally called themselves, I think it's interesting, Grand Central Depot, so essentially a train type of terminology, and then cheap and sort of easy to purchase prints. These were meant to be prints that you would frame in your house, that you would show your friends, that you could purchase and put on your wall, that you could save in a scrapbook. They created small images, so these would be anywhere from like 3 cents to 25 cents to purchase a small image. And then larger works such as this, which would range in about $3 or so to purchase. So it kind of was roughly the multiple cents to a couple dollar range in terms of money. Now thinking about Frances Flora Bond Palmer, she went by Fannie, and she created numerous images for Currier and Ives during her time of employment there. Now, leading up to the opening or sort of completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Currier and Ives did distribute dozens of train-related lithographs or prints, essentially, for purchase. Now, in thinking about the Transcontinental Railroad a little bit here, considering the time frame of that a little bit, so the gold rush, I talked about being kind of smack dab right in the middle of the 19th century, 1848 to 1853 roughly. The gold rush really helped to kind of hasten or speed up California's route to statehood. So the Compromise of 1850 helped with that, and California became a state. From there, we also have the Railway Act that goes into effect. Congress decides to give approval for or authorize the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So essentially a railroad that would go from Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, to California, or you could think about it as California to Omaha, Nebraska. So this idea that we would complete an entire railroad from East Coast to West Coast to East Coast. So with that, we have the Central Pacific Railway. We establish in many forms this sort of beginning in the San Francisco region. The first tracks are laid in Sacramento, so we're in the 1860s now. And we're thinking about how we're going to move sort of from California, from Sacramento region, east from here. So Francis Palmer is representing sort of aspects of that creation of the railway and then the literal connection between east and west and the movement through the scene itself. So what we have in this work here are a couple of things. First off, what we have, if we look at the left-hand side of the scene, this is the pioneer town. So what we have are individuals on the lower left, these sort of pioneer figures, all male figures who are chopping down trees, so literally altering that landscape to create the town that we see just below them. So in that town, we have numerous buildings, all made of sort of log cabin style buildings here. One of those is a public school, very clearly stated as public school in the sort of banner above the building itself. We also see numerous kind of areas for housing, various other public buildings. Oftentimes in images like this, we'll also see some church, a Christian church of some type. We see wagons, as in these folks have traveled in a wagon train, like over an overland trail to arrive in this town. We also see various women and men kind of lining the rail tracks on that lower left. In the center of the scene, this train is literally like chugging its way across the landscape. So it emerges from the right-hand side and kind of makes its way into the distance. All of the action of the scene is very much centered on the lower section, so sort of the foreground of the scene, very immediate to our space as a viewer. Now that train is literally puffing smoke across the landscape, and where that smoke travels from the smokestack is to the opposite side of the train tracks. And this is very deliberate. If we think about two sides of the track, oftentimes when we think of that, I think of, The Outsiders or West Side Story or something like that, where there's sort of the one side of the track, the opposite side of the track. And we see that here, and it's really, I think, interesting if we can zoom in on that right-hand side a little bit, because we have Native American individuals on horseback, represented fairly stereotypically, literally being engulfed by the smoke coming from the train, literally displaced by the physical train and its resulting sort of pollution of the region as well. So I think what's important here to acknowledge too is that it is representing in many ways Native American land rights, that Native American individuals were here, this was their land, this was their landscape, but have been very much displaced, removed, and forcibly so by this track that's coming in. What I want to acknowledge here as well is just this interesting divide, not only in the representation of the two various sets of individuals, but also in terms of the landscape itself. So removal of the landscape, establishment of a town, this sort of concept of industrialism or urbanness, But then also this sort of unfettered wilderness, right? We have the lake here. There's actually people in little boats on the lake as well. The mountains on the right in the deep distance. All of this sort of untouched landscape on the right-hand side. Lining the rail tracks, we do have telegraph poles, so this idea of communication that's linking the East Coast and the West Coast, and then literally the train, which will be the physical connector for people. On the train itself, you do see individuals in the windows on the train. And I just want to mention that the train itself, we think about moving people, and surely moving people and having people reside in the towns of California or the towns kind of in the West. But this is also a way of thinking about moving goods, moving consumer goods, moving product from one area of the country to the other. So I think that we have a question from some of the folks in the crowd, so I'd love to hear that and answer that.
All right, so we've got a question and what I'm going to take as a shout out. Okay. So I'll give you the question first. Someone's asking or observing that this is mostly not really a Sacramento kind of show, but it's curated to be a more broad appeal, maybe appealing to statewide cultural institutions, and then also really institutions that don't just cover the visual arts.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks so much for that comment and shout out. You're exactly right. So Sacramento, at least for me, is one important portion of the show, but it's not by any means the whole show. I think of this in some ways as the history of California. It's the visual reimagining of California as well. So a lot of this is how did we start out visually, and a lot of that's with the maps. Where are we now in rethinking about how many of these images were used to further specific ideals, to further propaganda? And with that, thank you from the crowd there, because that actually leads me to talk a little bit about the idea of manifest destiny, what I wanted to make sure that I talked about. So I'm going to mention that real quick, and then I know there's another question from the crowd. So manifest destiny, I mentioned this, and it's a very, I think, important and very, I think, deep and deeply rooted issue in our country. Manifest destiny was originally came about in the 1840s as a concept, and it was originally this idea of Europe having too much of a say or too much influence over America, the building of America, American politics. But as the 19th century continued to sort of expand, moving through the Civil War, Transcontinental Railroad, industrialism, it became this idea that it was a God-given right to literally expand westward. And this idea that it was a God-given right for those in the East to forcibly take the land or move themselves to the West. So some of what we see here with the sort of dichotomy or comparison between the pioneer town and the native individuals, and the train being the thing that connects but also divides, really relates to that manifest destiny concept or ideal, and that's addressed in the show as well. So I know there was another thought from the crowd.
All right, I want to interject with a shout out for the person who gave us a shout out first. So
okay.
Hi Michael at home, you're giving us great questions and comments in the chat. He did have a question specifically, what are the dates of these 3 lithographs, and then are they historical representations or contemporaneous depictions of a particular period?
Great question, Michael. Thanks so much for the shout out and for interacting with us today. So these date from the early 1860s. So these are right at the time when Congress passes or authorizes the railroad, so the Transcontinental Railroad from Omaha, Nebraska to California portion, so literally finishing off the railroad. I'll show you in a minute the Henry Jerome Shiel work as well, which is dated just about 2 years after the Francis Ford Palmer. So these are historic images. They were created during the 1860s, and they were created prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So that hopefully helps to answer your question, Michael, there. What I'd love to do now is actually turn to that Henry Jerome Shiel work, which is on my other side here. But what you're going to see, and I'm hoping you're asking yourself this, is wait a second, this literally looks almost like the exact same image that I've just seen. One of the coolest things for me in researching this exhibition and putting it all together was at first I thought, oh my gosh, those 85 images of San Francisco, they're all looking the same. Or these train images, they're all looking the same. But when you start to kind of dig in, you get this really amazing view of how a couple of years of difference can change the way we think about California, or how there's subtle variations in artistic style. So if we look at this work, this is Henry Jerome Scheele. So I mentioned Frances Flora Bon Palmer. She was born in England. She lived in America, spent her time in the New York region working for Courier and Ives. When we go to the Scheele work on the other side here, this is a German artist born in Germany. And you can see some of these exact same characteristics in this work. This is crossing the Humboldt River. So this is located in Nevada, like present day Nevada that we think about now. The Frances Flora Bon Palmer was a fictional town. This was no specific space or landscape, just the concept of a pioneer town. So what we see here is the same idea. The river is a dividing line between the pioneer town and Native American encampment on the right-hand side, but the train itself moving from that landscape is decidedly on the pioneer side and also decidedly making a differentiation or a divide between the two groups of people. What we see here are the tracks that have been laid. We have numerous men waiting alongside the tracks, and what I think is interesting here is the dominance of men in both scenes. This would have been part of the Gold Rush period in the sense that many of the individuals who moved to California or to the western region during this time would have been men. Most of the gold miners were men, but we do see some women kind of along the side in the back of the train tracks. Another public school represented here, another church represented on this side, and then we do have the deep distant landscape where we have the more expansive mountains and the terrain that would have been covered by those individuals moving on the overland trails. But what I want to narrow in on, if there's any way for us to zoom a little bit on that right-hand side, is to show you the way that the Native individuals are represented on that right-hand side. What we have are two figures on horseback. Those horses are very scared and sort of startled by the train coming along the tracks. And then we have women and children who are like fleeing the scene because of this train coming through. So there's a clear differentiation and distinction between the sort of solid pioneer, sort of successful figures on the right, and the way that we're representing Native figures, and this idea of sort of a quote unquote other, someone who doesn't understand progress. There's certainly a derogatory representation of the Native figures on the right-hand side. But in many ways, you're seeing those same things. Division of town, train tracks moving through the scene, expansive landscape, alteration of that landscape, and what the train means as both a divider and a connector during the period. So I do have another couple of images to show you. I wanted to show you one of the Frank Leslie's illustrated images of trains from this period, the 1860s. We saw a proliferation of train imagery, especially as we have the Transcontinental Railroad coming to a close in Promontory, Utah, as we close out the 1860s. And you can see in that image this idea between the two trains, the east and west, are about to shake hands, when in reality the Native figures have been completely displaced and forcibly removed from that land, and you can see them in the front there. I wanted to also talk a little bit, just briefly, about the importance of Chinese immigrant labor and the railroad, and this idea that there's no possible way the Transcontinental Railroad would have been completed without Chinese labor. Upwards of 20,000 Chinese laborers did treacherous work on the railroad, moving from the Sierra foothills all the way through to Utah as well. I just wanted to show you a couple of historic photographs from the period, one which includes a secret trestle that was made, where it literally they were concerned about the trestles being visible and weakened by shifting landscape, and so laborers went in and filled the trestle with dirt, like literally covering it up so that it looked like there was not a deep ravine. So it was backbreaking work, it was treacherous work, laborers also doing all of the essentially mine work or cutting into the stone or the landscape. And I have another image just to show you what some of that treacherous landscape looked like, especially moving over areas such as Donner Pass or the literal mountains that had to be cut through to create that railroad pass. There is I wanted to give also a shout out to the Chinese Rail Workers Project at Stanford University. If you're interested in this topic, there's a fantastic digital project that goes into all of the important historical research that's been done in the last decade related to this topic. But one of the things I wanted to bring forward is we don't often hear these stories in an art museum. We don't often see these stories in the images that we have, especially images that are considered to be drawings or prints. We might have photographs, but we don't often see it. And one of the things I want folks to think about, and hopefully I can encourage you to do so, is to come and think about what you're seeing, but also what you're not seeing in these images. What type of ideologies and themes and even propagandas being put forward, and what type of stories are being eliminated, displaced, or sort of hidden behind the scenes. I want to show you one additional work in the show here, which I've been kind of hovering in front of over time, but this is an advertisement for the Lightning Express. And what this is from 1876. So this is after the Transcontinental Railroad has already been in place for numerous years. But what we have at this time are additional sort of, in many ways, kind of tangential tracks as well. This is part of the Virginia Railroad, and what it did is it moved people from San Francisco Bay Area to the Sierra foothills. And in the Sierra foothills was the Comstock Lode at Mount Davidson. And this was essentially an area where you could mine, or they were mining for minerals, like mineral ore. And it was a very rich area. So this helped to move people to the region, but it also moved tools back and forth. So the train, as I mentioned, is part of that consumer good or industrialization. It was a much faster way than by wagon train or by horse and buggy or anything to that effect. The train could move those goods back and forth. So this is an advertisement from the period, as well as various sort of tickets and baggage claim information. And I know we have another image to show you here of what some of those advertisements looked like. They were incredibly elaborate and very much sort of fine art pieces unto themselves. So I'm thrilled that we're able to have some of these types of works in the show as well, to show you how the imagery helped to establish a certain concept of California, a certain concept of the railroad, and then oftentimes like these were kept as souvenirs afterwards. So we have quite a bit of this ephemera, so to speak, related to the railroad and related to California history. And you can see some of that imagery here. I wanted to show you the image on the screen as well because that was a ticket, a train ticket. So you can think about how elaborate that is and how much of that in many ways has now been lost. Everything is digital. We don't really have so many, physical tickets these days, especially things that were elaborately created by artists, lithographers, printmakers of the period. So it will be interesting to think about what comes next in the 100 years of California history and how that digital will become a much different way of thinking about an exhibition such as this. So with that, I think we are going to come to a close for today. It's been really fun to talk to you about the exhibition. I hope that you'll come and see it in person. There's lots to think about, lots to see, lots to get up close and look at. And I also want to give a big shout out to those of you who were live with me today, to Michael for your great questions, and then to Mallory, Brian, and Houghton for being with me and producing the segment. So come back again to Gallery Bytes, come back to the Crocker, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot.